Wow. 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 I'm so glad they put up these barricades. Yeah, I don't like you that much, you know. From a distance, you're okay, but that's it. No closer, no closer. Okay, as you know, Socrates in the City is a forum where over the years I have interviewed the candidates for the highest office in the nation. And it's not a laugh line, if you don't mind. If you don't mind. I've asked each of them, from Pat Paulson, Shirley Chisholm, Dick Gephardt, all through the years, I've asked each of them, who the hell are you? Excuse me, who are you to think that you would dare be president of the United States and hold the same office as Washington and Adams and Jefferson and Lincoln and Biden? Okay, you know I'm kidding. This is not, we've never ever here, I've never interviewed anyone running for office, much less running for president. We do not do politics at Socrates in the City. We ask the big questions, what we call life, God, and other small topics. And tonight, thank you. And tonight, I have the privilege of having a conversation with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. about his life and about America, past, present, and future. If you followed Socrates in the City over the years, you know that I have interviewed astronauts, men who have walked on the moon, men and women who have not walked on the moon, and everything in between. Think about that. We've interviewed poets, novelists, scientists, theologians, TV stars like my friend Dick Cavett. Now, I should say the closest we ever came to doing politics here was about 15 or 17 years ago when my guest was Governor Mike Huckabee, but that was not to discuss anything political, but it was rather a conversation to explore the intellectual themes set forth in his book, Guns, Grits, and Gravy. And by the way, no, that book did not win the Pulitzer Prize, but on the upside, it was also not ghostwritten by Ted Sorensen. So anyway, we take the higher intellectual path at Socrates. This will not be a hard-hitting journalistic interview, although many people do think that I look and sound a little bit like George Stephanopoulos and a lot like Christiane Amanpour. Thank you. Thank you. So there'll be no hard-hitting journalistic questions, nor do I approve of asking flippant questions of someone running for president. I will not, for example, be asking the question boxers or briefs. Incidentally, Joe Biden was asked that question recently, boxers or briefs. His answer, depends. But in all seriousness, we stick to intellectual themes at Socrates. Sometimes the discussion can turn literary. Tonight, I will, among other things, be tipping my hat to Dante Alighieri by asking our distinguished guest what level of hell he believes Anthony Fauci will be consigned to. And that, excuse me, it's a strictly literary question. I put him down with Judas, Brutus, and Cassius, you know, encased in the ice. That's just, we'll see what Bobby's has to say. Now, I have to be upfront. It was a challenge for me to agree to this interview. That's because while I sincerely admire Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Very much, I have nonetheless been very public and very vocal in my support of Joe Biden. I'm just a Biden guy. I have always been a Biden man ever since that night when I sold my soul to the devil. It was at a crossroads at midnight under a full moon. There was a dead cat involved. And I remember we summoned the ghost of Corn Pop. Anyway, in keeping with the promise I made to Lucifer that night, I wouldn't want to be, by having this forum, want to be seen as giving aid and comfort to anyone challenging Joe Biden. All right, a word on the RFK Jr. moniker, right? I just have to say, with a name like Metaxas, a lot of Greek names and stuff, I don't understand why Kennedy needs to be shortened. It's a pretty simple name. Is it too complicated? No. Of course, I trace the negative trends in our history to when this happened. You got JFK, you get RFK, then you get LBJ. Before you know it, you have J-Lo and AOC. And I just want to know, I want to ask, Mr. Kennedy, are you proud that your family, of this legacy of bringing, for example, K-Fed into American culture? All right, I think we better get serious for a second here. It is genuinely my honor to have as my guest this evening to talk about America, past, present, and future, my esteemed guest, RFK Jr. Please welcome him. There he is.
Thank you, everybody.
I have a million questions I want to ask you. I want to start, let me just say, can I throw you an easy one, real easy? What's the capital of North Dakota? It's only easy if you know it. Bismarck. He knew it. Bismarck. For a Kennedy, that's a softball. I knew he would know that. No, I want to start. 2 days from now, there's going to be a debate on CNN from which you have been excluded. I wanted to get your thoughts on that. And do you feel that? Well, yeah. What are your feelings? Because I have to say, that was big news when I read it, and I'm glad you could be with us tonight.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me, Eric. I've looked forward to talking with you. I've been an admirer of yours for a long, long time. I'm very, very grateful to be here with everybody. A few thoughts about the debate. One is that CNN, we know from the Washington Post and other reports that CNN met with President Trump and President Biden, and that they all agreed that I should be excluded from the debating stage. There's an FEC rule that says that kind of collusion is illegal, that the networks can stage a debate, but they have to have established and neutral criteria to determine who gets on the stage, and is not intended to exclude a particular other campaign. And otherwise, the debate is an illegal campaign contribution, which I would argue this debate is. They established criteria. The two exclusionary criteria that they established was, one, that all the candidates any candidate to get on the stage must be on enough ballots in enough states to get 270 electoral votes. And I'm the only one that comes close to qualifying for that, because I have enough signatures now to get about 340 electoral votes. And neither President Trump nor President Biden is on the ballot in any state. They have an expectation that their parties are going to nominate them, and then they will be on the ballot. But at this point, they are not. The other criteria they used was CNN picked 12 polling companies. It excluded the most important polling company, which is Harvard-Harris, which has got me about 18%. And it chose 12 polling companies and said that anybody to get on the stage needed to have a 15% minimum and at least 4 polls from among those companies. And we submitted to CNN 6 polls. They excluded the Harvard-Harris poll. They excluded one, and one of those polls, by the way, was a CNN poll that has me at 16% from last month. And they excluded, at the last minute to get me off, they excluded just arbitrarily, a poll from Monmouth, which was one of the companies they designated, and that poll, I think, has me at 17%. And I don't mean to sound like I'm griping, because I'm not, but this is something Americans should be concerned about, because they had to get rid of the Presidential Commission on Debates, which has been operating all the debates since 1988. The first debate was my uncle's debate in '60. And since then, there has never been a private company that has owned the debate, the presidential debate. It's never happened before. This year, in order to get away from the Presidential Commission, which would have put me on the stage, they cut a side deal with CNN, and it looks fishy.
Who cut a side deal?
The Biden and Trump campaigns. And they said during that conversation, both campaigns said, we want to keep Kennedy off the stage. And this is reported by the Washington Post. And, but it looks particularly fishy, because both of those companies are going to get tens of millions minimum and probably hundreds of millions of dollars, or both of those campaigns are going to contribute tens or hundreds of millions of dollars to CNN. And so it's a conflict of interest, and it really is just a long campaign commercial for those two campaigns. And the other thing I would say about it is that CNN, the most consequential political decision over the past, during those two administrations, had to do with COVID. And the lockdown of our country for 500 days, which both President Trump and President Biden went along with. And that decision shifted $4.3 trillion from the American middle class to this new oligarchy of billionaires. They created a billionaire a day in 500 days, 500 new billionaires. And they shut down 3.3 million businesses. They shut down all the churches with no due process, no just compensation. They shut down jury trials in violation of the Seventh Amendment for anybody injured by a countermeasure. They shut down the Fifth Amendment guarantee of due process and just compensation when somebody closed your business and injured your property value. And they shut down freedom of speech, both of them. So the government started actively censoring for the first time in history, pressuring social media and media companies not to publish critiques of their policies, their political decisions. This was very, very consequential for our country, but the biggest cheerleader was CNN. Oh, Jake Tapper was out there shaming people who, violated mask mandates, or who weren't staying in their homes, or who weren't getting weren't submitting to the medical interventions that they were demanding. And I feel like somebody should be on that stage asking all three of them about their role in it, not just President Trump and President Biden, but the role of the media, which completely collapsed during COVID. Louis Brandeis said, the role of the media in a democracy is to maintain a fierce posture of skepticism toward government authorities and toward official pronouncements. And that was what the media did in this country for the first 285 years of our existence. But in the last decade, and particularly culminating in COVID, you saw the media completely take the opposite posture. The media became the mouthpiece for government policies. It shamed people who dissented from them and disagreed. It silenced them, it marginalized them, it gaslit them. People who said that they had an injury from one of the interventions, people who complained about the impacts of their children on the school closures, people who said, you don't have any evidence that masks are actually based on science or social distancing. Those people became heretics and had to be silenced and discredited and burned, and the media was leading that rather than being skeptical towards government authority. So, I think it's disturbing, the exercise. We're going to do a kind of a live stream that includes me in the debate on X.
So while the debate is happening on CNN,
Yeah.
you're going to do, describe it again. You said
We're going to do a live stream that will have me at a podium. It'll kind of look like I'm on the stage with them. But CNN has said this is proprietary, and we're going to sue you if you do that. And we're going to do it anyway. There's never. And Elon, who's supporting us on this,
You're talking about Elon Musk?
Yeah.
Because he and I are not on a first-name basis. I just want to be clear.
but
I know you'd
everybody-
assume that.
there's
You'd
only
assume
one
that.
Elon.
But yes, I know. So far.
Yeah.
So far. Well, no, but so you're going to be doing something during the debate where you're doing commentary. It's
Yeah,
like,
I'll
it's like
be
a little bit like
answering the
Mystery
questions,
Science
too.
Theater. What?
I'll be answering the questions.
But how are you going to find time? In other words, I'm not clear on how that's going to work.
This is the miracle of technology. There'll be a slight delay, but we're going to catch up with them there's 2 breaks, and
Yeah.
so
Okay.
it'll be. We don't know if we'll pull it off, but we're going to do it.
Do you feel? I think. I think it strikes me that, I mean, one of the reasons that I wanted to talk to you is because you've been very bold in saying things that, quote unquote, you're not supposed to say. And as you just said, the mainstream media has been, I mean, complicit is actually a nice word. They have been profoundly guilty, really, in going along with certain narratives. It seems to me because of that, not just CNN, but the mainstream media, so-called, has effectively been censoring you. They particularly dislike you because you've taken them on. So I want to ask you, to respond to that, and also to talk about where do you get that from, that idea that you're going to be talking about things, even going way back to speaking critically of vaccines. What's the provenance of that kind of thinking on your part?
Well, let me answer the first question and then get a clarification from you on what the second question is. The first question is, I've been censored for many years in a way that's not illegal. It's corporate censorship. There's 2 kinds of censorship. One is I was saying things beginning in 2005 when I started talking about vaccines. And by the way, I got dragged into that controversy kicking and screaming. It's not something that I wanted to do. I got there because I was litigating at that time in about 40 suits. Again, I'll go back a little. In 2003, the National Academy of Sciences and the FDA joint published a study that showed that every freshwater fish in America had dangerous levels of mercury in its flesh.
I'm sorry, every what?
Freshwater fish.
Every freshwater fish.
Yeah, it had dangerous levels of mercury in its flesh. So I was at that time the founder and leader of the biggest water protection group in the world, and it was started by commercial and recreational fishermen here on the Hudson, but it spread so that we had 350 patrol boats on waterways all over North America and 46 other countries. And this report really shook people up because we knew there was a lot of mercury in tunas, but this is all the freshwater fish, literally.
Well, and tuna is not a freshwater fish.
That's what I'm saying. We all knew about tuna and
Right,
swordfish.
right.
Those are saltwater predatory fish.
Right.
People didn't know about, that largemouth bass, smallmouth bass, brim, crappie, yellow perch, white perch.
I've
muskie.
literally never heard this until now.
Yeah, every freshwater fish that they tested.
Yeah.
So we started, and the mercury was coming from coal burning power plants. Some of it was coming from mining in the western states, but most of it was coming from cement kilns and coal burning power plants. So I had about 40 lawsuits in Canada and the United States against those plants for emitting mercury. And I was lecturing around the country, trying to get legislation, et cetera. these women would show up at every one of my lectures, and they weren't the same, they were different, but they would always arrive early, they'd sit in the front seats, and then afterward they'd come up to me, and they were always very well dressed, very well spoken, and very well informed, and they would tell me in a very respectful but vaguely scolding way, if you really are concerned about mercury exposures to children, you need to look at vaccines. And as it turns out, they were all the mothers of intellectually disabled children who they believed had been injured by the vaccines, mercury or aluminum in the vaccines. And
You said intellectually disabled, so not just autistic or on the so-called spectrum.
They had all kinds of intellectual disabilities, but a lot of them were related to autism. They're ADD, ADHD, speech delay, language delay, tics, Tourette's syndrome, narcolepsy, ASD, autism. The autism rates had expanded dramatically. My generation, 70-year-old men, the autism rate is 1 in 10,000 today, right now. The autism rate in my children's generation is 1 in every 34 kids, 1 in every 22 boys. And it's higher in states like New Jersey and Utah. And I've literally never seen anybody with full-blown autism my age. You know, by full-blown autism, I mean nonverbal, non-toilet trained, head banging, stimming, toe walking, hand flapping. Never seen it. And I've been around intellectual disabilities my whole life. My Aunt Eunice Shriver was the founder of Special Olympics, and I worked in Camp Shriver, which became Special Olympics in 1968. I worked as a hugger and a coach from when I was 7 years old. Every weekend, I worked for 200 hours in Wassaic Home for the Retarded up in near Pauling, New York, when I was in high school. And so I was around this as part of my family DNA. I never saw anybody who had anybody during my early years who had autism. It just started appearing, and it went dramatically appeared. In fact, Congress said to the EPA, what year did the autism become an epidemic? And EPA came back. And EPA is a captive agency, but it's captive by oil, coal, and chemical industry. It's not captive by pharma. And it came back with an honest study, and it said in 1989, it's a red line. This tsunami started in 89. And in 89, a lot of these other injuries suddenly appeared that we now see that are now, when my uncle was president, 6% of Americans had chronic disease. Today, 60% do. And it's the biggest bill on our national budget. It's 5 times the military budget. The bill for chronic disease, $4.3 trillion a year. And all these other chronic diseases appeared on the same timeline. Food allergies. If you're my age, you never knew anybody. I had 11 siblings. I had 70 first cousins. Some of them are here, I saw them. But I never knew anybody with a peanut allergy. Why do 5 of my 7 kids have food allergies? Something happened, right? Nobody ever saw this before. Eczema suddenly appeared, asthma, anaphylaxis, all these allergies. Asthma was around. I had a brother who had asthma. His doctor told him, there will never be a cure for asthma because it's so rare that nobody will ever study it. And today, 1 out of every black kids in New York City has asthma. All of this happened around 1989, and then all the autoimmune diseases. Juvenile diabetes, rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, Crohn's disease, all these exotic diseases that we never heard of that are now everywhere. When I was
Why
a kid,
1989?
Let me give you one other example. When I was a kid, the typical pediatrician would see 1 case of diabetes in his career. A 40-year career, 1 case of juvenile diabetes. Today, in America, 1 out of every 3 kids who walks through his office door is pre-diabetic or diabetic. It's caused just that 1 category of disease is greater than our military budget. Nobody's saying anything about it. It's the biggest issue. Because, you know, if our economy collapses, the dollar collapses as the global reserve currency, we have wars, whatever. We're resilient people. We're tough. We're innovative. We're entrepreneurial. We can recover from anything. We can't recover from this. And if you have one of these lifelong diseases, your soul is crushed. You're dependent on pharma and drugs, and they never get it right. There's a whole generation of kids that are damaged today. And they're damaged in ways that we see, and they're damaged in ways that we don't see. You know, a lot of the social awkwardness and all that, which is characteristic of vaccine injury and other injuries. I'm not saying this is all from vaccines. The vaccine schedule changed that year. It's not the only thing. A lot of things happened that year, and there's about 13 culprits. There's a very famous scientist, toxicologist here in New York named Phil Landrigan, who I've used as a witness in many, many of my cases. He has a claim to be the most important toxicologist in the country. He's looked at this issue and he said, there's about 13 things that it could be, but it's probably a combination of all of them. Our kids are swimming around in a toxic soup. They're glyphosate and Roundup, neonicotinoid pesticides, atrazine, which is in 63% of our water supply, PFOAs and PFASs, which I litigated on. They made a film about my case called Dark Waters, starring Mark Ruffalo. These are the forever chemicals that are in, that are flame retardants. They put in all of our furniture that year. They put it in our children's pajamas.
You keep
everywhere.
saying, so that's in 89.
Around that
time.
timeline, high fructose corn syrup, cell phone Wi-Fi radiation, you know, fluoride is part of it, but it doesn't really follow the timeline. But these are all of these chemicals operate along the same biological pathways. So it's probably accumulation of these that injures people, and the kids you see injured are kids who have a poor mitochondrial function. So the mitochondria are the energy centers of their cells, and you can stress them so much and they will recover. But if you stress them too much, they collapse, and then there's a cascading effect that results in severe brain damage. And these kids are probably just hitting one too many exposure. And but anyway, the vaccine. What happened with vaccines is in 1986, the vaccine. When I was a kid, I had 3 vaccines, and I was fully compliant. My kids have 72 vaccines. Today, this generation is going to have 79 because of the COVID vaccine, the annual COVID vaccine. Oh, and the big change was 1989. And what happened was in the late 70s, they created a new vaccine called the diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis vaccine. And that vaccine was very reactogenic. A lot of kids were getting injured. 1 out of every 300 kids was dying or having permanent brain damage. The Wyeth, which was the biggest producer, went to the Reagan White House and said to Reagan, and by the way, my uncle, the Democrats were also, my uncle was head of the health committee. He was part of this too. And they went to him and said, we're losing $20 in downstream liability for every dollar that we make in profits, and we're all going to get out of the vaccine business unless you give us blanket immunity from liability. Oh, Reagan went along with it, and they passed the Vaccine Act in 1986, and all of a sudden these companies were immune from liability. Well, the biggest cause for every medicine is downstream liability, is the injuries that they cause, that you have to pay up off. So now they had this product where you're immune from that. And there's a couple of other things about that product. One, vaccines were exempt from the very beginning from safety studies. So it's the only medical product that is not safety tested before use. Every other medical product has to have placebo-controlled trials that are 5 or 7 years because you have side effects that have long diagnostic horizons, long incubation periods, so you have to watch what happens for a long period of time. Vaccines are exempt. Why? Because the vaccine program was developed by the Public Health Service, which was CDC's predecessor agency, and the Public Health Service is a military agency. It's one of the 5 uniformed military services. That's why they have ranks like Surgeon General. And the vaccine program was developed as a national security defense against biological attacks against our country. So they wanted to make sure if the Russians attacked us with anthrax or some other biological agent, we could quickly formulate a vaccine and deploy it to 280 million Americans with no regulatory impediments. And they said, if we call it a medicine, we're going to have to do a 5 or 7-year safety test. So let's call it something else. We'll call it biologic, and we will exempt biologics from safety testing.
What year are we talking? Is this Dick Cheney?
No, that was much, much earlier. This is how it evolved from, the smallpox vaccines and the polio vaccines, et cetera. None of them ever had to be tested for safety. So they were tested for efficacy. Do they prevent the disease? Yes. But are there other bad things that happen? We don't know. So you don't know the risk profile. And so none of them were subjected. And then the third advantage they had, so that the exempt from safety testing saves them $250 million. And they have another huge advantage, which is they don't have to do any advertising or marketing because the federal government is ordering 76 million kids to consume the product. So they have an automatic market. So then also, NIH makes them and formulates them. And then they give them to the pharmaceutical industry. So every step of the economy, it is the perfect product. And there was a gold rush to put more and more vaccines on the schedule to mandate them to kids, because if you can get it mandated, it's $1 billion guaranteed profit for you. So all of these companies, the 4 big companies, all of them, were committing criminal acts in their other parts of their business, Vioxx and all this. They killed 500,000 people knowingly and had to pay $7 billion in criminal penalties. The same company, with this product, they can never get caught. They can never be held
I want to cut
liable.
to the chase. What you're describing sounds to me like evil. When you're talking about human beings knowingly doing what you're talking about, knowing they're going to make money and being willing to get away with it, in the interest of time, I'll just call that evil. Were you?
Upton Sinclair.
I did not expect people to bring up Upton Sinclair. I want to be honest. But go ahead. Go ahead.
He said something very wise, which is useful, which is that it's very hard to persuade a man of a fact if the existence of that fact will diminish his salary. We all, as human beings, have the capacity for self-delusion, and we can convince ourselves that what we're doing is saving lives, and that maybe there's a few necessary collateral damage. But we're saving millions of people from polio and measles and smallpox. So the people who complain about it have to be silenced and gaslit. And it's probably not that many anyway.
There's a continuum.
Yeah, there's a continuum.
When we're talking about people in the industry. Since you wrote a book about Anthony Fauci, let me ask you, do you think that he genuinely believes that what he has done is a good thing?
One of the things I did with that book, and what I try to do with all of my writing, is I never look into his head. So I don't know. Well, I don't know how conscious he is, but what I show is what he did. And it's clear that he knew what he was doing on many of these was wrong, because he then would go up afterwards and actively deceive people and cover it up. So, but I can't tell exactly what's going on in his head or Bill Gates' head. I can tell you that he played this extraordinary role in history, which was as the architect of the capture of one of the greatest federal agencies in American history and world history. NIH was the premier scientific agency, research agency on Earth. When I was growing up, it was revered all around the world, and it was gold standard medicine, and it was very careful, and it had, people like Bernice Eddy, these great heroes of science and medicine. And only America had that. There's no other nation in the world that had anything like NIH. I lived 10 minutes from NIH when I was a kid. There was a scientist who was married to a woman who worked for my mother, and I wanted to be a scientist when I was growing up, so I would go to NIH all the time and look through the microscopes and see the mice and the rats and the guinea pigs in the cages, and that was just fascinating to me. What happened in 1980, we passed a law called the Bayh-Dole Act, and it was about the time that Anthony Fauci, almost exactly the time that he took over NIH. He'd been there since '68. He took over in '80, and the Bayh-Dole Act said that scientists who work for NIH and NIH itself, if they assist in researching a drug that then becomes profitable, they can collect royalties on it. So, for example, the Moderna vaccine is owned by NIH, 50%. Oh, half the profits from Moderna go to NIH. And there are 6 individuals at NIH who make $150,000 a year forever. They're the high-level individuals who have margin rights for the patents. And so, that kind of relationship destroyed NIH. And NIH became the biggest incubator for pharmaceutical products. It stopped doing real science, and it just develops products for the companies. I think in 2016, there were 220 new drugs approved by FDA, and 100% of them came out of NIH. So you have, and people there are making money on it. And these are the regulators that are supposed to be looking for problems in the products to protect our health. If they're paying their mortgage on that, they're buying their boats, they're putting their kids through school, they're paying their alimony.
Greed, it's hard to pretend like it's okay. I mean, everybody wants money, everybody wants to get a pension. But what you're describing has done unspeakable evil to many, many human beings. And you, it seems to me that you're part of the answer to the second part of the question. Where did this come from that you were willing to speak out against these kinds of things? Was your awareness of this?
And by that, you mean...
for you to become outspoken on
what
this.
What inclined me, or what discovery was it that made me say, hey, this is, the building is burning down? Is that what you're saying?
Not just that, but to be willing to be called, to be vilified, to be called a conspiracy theorist by, the entire establishment, to be willing to suffer those slings and arrows, why were you willing to do that? Was it just a sense that it was right and that you had to be a voice for those people?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things. One is, I think I was raised in a milieu where, you were, I've told this story before, but my dad, about 2 weeks before he died, my dad gave me this book to read by Camus, which is called The Plague. And it's about a doctor.
That's not a typical dad move.
No, but
you're aware.
I know, but he would give me periodically books to read or poems to read. But he gave me this book with a special intensity. He said, you need to read this. Oh, I never read it before he died, and after he died, I read it several times in order to kind of decode, what the message was that it seemed like an important message that he was trying to give me. The book is about a medical doctor in a quarantine city in Northern Europe, and there's a plague ravaging the city, a very, very high infection fatality rate. Nobody knows how to treat it, and a lot of the beginning of the book is the doctor having a conversation in his own head. should I go out of my apartment? Because if I do, I'm probably going to die. I'm not going to be able to help anybody anyway. So isn't it just the most prudent thing to lock myself in here and wait this out? And eventually he goes out and he does his job consoling people, etc. And Camus was was an existentialist. He was the legatee of the ideology of Stoicism, which was a Greek and Roman philosophy, a very, very beautiful approach to life, and that my father really was heavily influenced by after the death of his brother. My father was always a Roman Catholic. In order to process his brother's death and to make sense of this disorderly universe, he began exploring other philosophies. He read the Greeks. He read Edith Hamilton. He read the poets. He read Shakespeare and a lot of existentialists. And he really integrated Stoicism into his own character. And the kind of iconic hero of Stoicism is Sisyphus. And Sisyphus was a man who had done a favor for humanity that had displeased the gods. They cursed him to push a boulder up the hill all day long, every day for eternity. And his job was to push it over the hill, but he could never get over the top. When he got to the top of the hill, just before he pushed it over, it would roll back on him and mangle him, and then roll down the hill. And he'd spend all night long walking back down the hill to the boulder, and then he'd push it up again. And in the view of many people, Sisyphus would have been a miserable person. But in the view of the Stoics, he was an insanely happy man because he had a job, he knew what it was, and he put his shoulder to the stone.
Did Camus write a book called The Myth of Sisyphus?
Yeah, and he wrote about Sisyphus Smiles, and it was. The message was that, life is not supposed to be easy. Life is supposed to be hard, but that out of that hardship, that pain is the touchstone for spiritual growth. That we do not grow without hardship, without discipline, and that in doing and taking our own task and performing that task, even if it's unpleasant, even if you're surrounded by people who don't like you or hate you or deride you, that you're bringing order to a chaotic universe, and you're kind of throwing down a gauntlet at the gods, at the absurdity of life, and you're bringing order to it, and you're bringing ultimately a kind of joy to it.
I thought you were going someplace when you mentioned that your father gave you the Plague by Camus. That's the book that he gave you. And that you were going to say something about the plague or whatever. But also, I should interject.
Well, I followed Camus to try to figure
right.
this out.
What almost no one knows, and it's in the book that I gave to you, published by Skyhorse, our mutual publisher, also Woody Allen's. Camus, at the end of his life, became a Christian. No one knows this, and I talk about it in my book. Just a note. But to go back to what you're saying, because there's so much here, there are nefarious, forces at work. The way they have tried to silence you on these issues, what many of us have lived through in the last, since COVID, it's dark stuff. But I think that as a result of what happened very recently with COVID, a lot of people have woken up, and a lot of people have begun to ask questions. And I think that what we today might call the deep state, the vast bureaucracy that insists that you go along with a certain narrative, Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex. And it seems to me, just going back to kind of where you got some of your instincts from to stand against this, it seems to me that your uncle and to some extent your father were in the 60s at war with these forces. And I think you have said that you believe that the CIA was involved in your uncle's murder? I mean, most of us grew up in a world where we kind of thought, no, that's probably conspiracy theory. It's too complicated. We'll just go along with it. Yeah, the Warren Commission's probably wrong, but we don't want to go there. But in more recent years, people like me, I think increasingly have gone there and have said, what's going on? What's the narrative beneath the narrative? We've been told this and this and this, and I think more people are waking up to that. More people are receptive to the idea that if the medical establishment says take that jab or that vaccine or whatever, that maybe you shouldn't. Maybe you should think for yourself. Maybe you should be careful what you eat. So I want to go back to the murder of your uncle. At what point did you realize what we're talking about? Because I just want to say, as a patriotic American, the idea that there be forces in our own government capable of that, very, very hard to process. At what point did you begin to think about that?
Well, I'll say something about this, that Eisenhower gave that speech on January 17th, 1961. It was my birthday. It was 3 days before my uncle took the oath of office, which I was present for. Eisenhower didn't do that on my birthday deliberately.
They're not having the debate on my birthday deliberately.
It was his farewell address,
Yeah.
but it was this extraordinary speech. And incidentally, if you read that speech, it was very short. And he warned the emergence of a military-industrial complex, that it would subvert democracy and destroy all of our values and destroy our country from within. In the next paragraph, he said, and equally bad, the rise of a federal medical scientific establishment that would destroy public health and erode, the credibility of science, et cetera. It's very, very prescient and really brilliant speech. And to me, it should be required reading for every kid in this, a school kid. My uncle spent 3 years battling his military-industrial complex, refusing to go to war. He refused to send troops to Laos. He refused to. In '61, he refused to send, troops during the Bay of Pigs. In '61, he refused in '62 to go into Berlin and the Checkpoint Charlie crisis. He refused to go into Cuba again in '62 or '63 in the missile crisis, and then he refused to send combat troops to Vietnam. He ended up, they wanted 250,000 combat troops, and he said, no, I'm not going to do it. And then he ended up sending 16,000 advisors who weren't allowed to participate in combat. He found out in October, they did anyway, they're mainly Green Berets and helicopter pilots. He found out on October 22nd, 1962, he learned that a Green Beret had died. He asked Walt Rostow for a casualty list, and Rostow came back and said 75 men have died. And he said, that's too many. We're bringing them all home. That afternoon, he signed National Security Order 263, ordering all U.S. military personnel out of Vietnam, with the first 1,000 coming back the following in December. 30 days to the day that he signed that order, he was murdered. And a week later, President Johnson remanded that order and ended up sending 250,000 troops. My father ran against the war in '68. He was killed during that campaign, and then Nixon came in and sent 560,000, and 56,000 never came home, including George Skakel, who's over here. We have another cousin called George Skakel who died in the Tet Offensive, so he was one of the people who never came home. But my uncle, you asked when I first occurred to me, it occurred to me while I was standing in the East Room of the White House in November 24th, 1963, with my uncle's casket. And President Johnson came in and said that the person who killed my uncle, Lee Harvey Oswald, had just been shot and murdered in the police station by a man named Jack Ruby. And when Johnson turned around, I was with my mother, with Jackie, and my father at the time. I turned to my mom and I said, why did he do that? Did he love our family? So my brain was already, this doesn't make any sense. And, later it turned out that he was a gun runner for the mob, and was involved in the Cuba operations, et cetera. Now, I won't try to convince anybody that the CIA killed my uncle. There's 100 books on it, at least. The best book, an extraordinary scholar who does a really good job at distilling all of the millions of pages of research. I think at least 30 people who were involved directly in the murder have made full confessions, a lot of them on their deathbeds. And the person who distills that, I think, better than any of the other books is Jim Douglas in his book, which is called The Unspeakable. So anybody who's curious about that and you want to just read one book, that would be, to me, the book to read. My father, and then, the CIA has for 60 years prevented the release of the documents. And we know the agents involved. We know Bill Harvey was involved. We know David Atlee Phillips. We know exactly what they were doing. And then there's things that we don't know, but E. Howard Hunt, who made a full confession, a deathbed confession, and many others. My father's death, I always assumed was that Sirhan killed my father. He made a full confession. And he was then, there were 77 eyewitnesses. And so it never, ever occurred to me that he did not kill my dad. And then a guy called Paul Schrade, who was a union leader, he was the number 3 guy at the UAW, the United Auto Workers, a very close friend with my father. He had recruited Cesar Chavez to the labor movement. And Cesar Chavez became one of my father's closest personal friends and political allies. And Paul Schrade was standing next to my father when he was shot, and Paul took the first bullet in his head. He lived to be 95 years old, and he died about 2 years ago. And the last 20 years of his life, he was fighting to get Sirhan out of jail. He asked me to come to his house and read the autopsy report, which, believe me, was the last thing I wanted to do. Because of his closeness to my father and because of the sacrifice he made, I ultimately went there and I sat down at his kitchen table and read this report. And that was the first time it occurred to me that Sirhan had not killed my father. And the autopsy report by Thomas Noguchi, Noguchi was the most important coroner in American history. That autopsy is known as the perfect autopsy because Noguchi knew what had happened in Dallas, where there was all this, screwy stuff with the autopsies. And he was determined that would not happen in Los Angeles. So he invited the chief coroner of all the branches of the armed service to observe, and other famous coroners to observe his autopsy. And they were all in the theater at that time, and he did this autopsy that is extraordinary. And what he found was that Sirhan was waiting for my father in front of a steam table in the kitchen of the Ambassador Hotel. It was a route my father was not supposed to have taken. He was supposed to go out through the ballroom, but someone led him through the kitchen and directly into this ambush. Sirhan was waiting and fired 2 shots at my father. The first shot hit Paul Schrade. The second shot hit a door jamb behind my father at head level and was later removed by the LAPD. He was then grabbed by 6 men, including the 1960 decathlon champion Rafer Johnson, who was one of my father's best friend, Roosevelt Greer, who was one of the fearsome foursome, and a number of other people. They grabbed him and they pointed his gun. They grabbed his hand first and bent him over the steam table. So he was on the steam table on his back, and they forced his arm away from my dad. Rafer Johnson later told me, although Sirhan is a tiny little guy, he had superhuman strength. and that he could not pry the pistol from his hand. And Sirhan squeezed off 6 more shots and emptied the gun. Only eight, it was a revolver, with only 8 shots in it. He never reloaded. All 6 of those shots hit people. So we know what happened to every shot in the gun. The audios show 14 shots being fired. My father was killed by 4 shots from behind. Sirhan was always 5 feet in front of him. And there was 77 eyewitnesses that he was always in front of me. He never was behind my dad.
The larger question is who, in other words,
So, wait, if you give me 1 minute, I'll finish. And I think I'm going to answer your question. All of those shots, according to Noguchi, were contact shots, meaning that the shots were, the gun was touching my father's body and left a carbon tattoo. And they were fired from behind. The man who was standing there was a man named Eugene Thane Cesar, who was the security guard who had led my father into the ambush. And he had one hand, his right hand was, or his left hand was holding my father's left elbow. He was standing behind him, and he had his gun drawn. He was witness with it. My father, when he died, he fell, and I was with my dad when he died. When he fell backwards onto Cesar, and Cesar was on the floor below him, and my father must have known that he was being shot from behind, because the last thing he did was reach around and pull off Cesar's clip-on tie. And the photographs of my father on the floor have him with that clip-on tie in his hand. And Cesar then pushed him off and got up with his gun drawn, which everybody saw. He later told the police that he had been firing at Sirhan, but nobody ever saw that. There's no evidence of that. My father was shot 4 times. One of the shots went through his shoulder pad harmlessly and into the ceiling. The other shots were, fatal. The worst shot was the one behind his ear, but it left a carbon tattoo. And there's a recent book about Eugene Thane Cesar. I had communications with Eugene Cesar, who died during COVID. But I was talking to him at that time and seeing if I could come visit him. He'd moved to the Philippines. He was an avowed racist. He hated my family. He had gotten the job 2 days before as a security guard at a security company, and had never been employed as a security guard before. His real job was at the Lockheed and formerly the Hughes airline plants in Los Angeles, which are CIA operations. Lisa Pease, who's done the most thorough book on my dad's murder, found documentation where Cesar identifies himself as a CIA agent. So I don't know, and I can't say there's,
Well, the larger question, I mean, because I don't think anybody here would dispute what you're saying. The larger question is, who is so interested in keeping this information from coming out? In other words, we're talking about extraordinarily dark forces in our own government that are operating to this day, it seems to me. And it seems that's part of your passion in doing what you do, even running for president. Do you have any sense that this swamp could be drained? Any sense that that these forces could be exposed? I mean, whether we're talking about the NIH, whether we're talking about the CIA, it's dramatic to think that our tax dollars are funding this kind of thing. And I think many Americans are rather recently waking up to what we're dealing with. I mean, you called at some point for the end of NATO. There seems to be an awakening that the narrative that we've gone along with is one that we've been duped, basically, and that we need to have a deeper understanding of things than we've had, basically. But what is your sense of whether it's possible. I mean, is this utterly quixotic, or is there any sense that it's possible for us to, uncover some of these bad actors and call them to account?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very confident if I'm elected president that I can dismantle the deep state. And the reason that I feel uniquely able to do it is because it really, you're seeing this corrupt merger of state and corporate power that includes the military-industrial complex, includes the pharmaceutical industry, but includes all of these other industries that have captured the agencies that are supposed to regulate them. Those agencies have become sock puppets for the industries they're supposed to regulate, and the CIA is a captive agency of the military-industrial complex. They're not working for you and me. They're working for Raytheon and General Dynamics and Lockheed and Boeing and Northrop Grumman and BlackRock, which owns all of those companies and owns Pfizer. BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard own 88% of the S&P 500, and they own all the pharma, including they're the three major owners of BlackRock. They're the same people who control the Fed, and they control all of the, they've got the contracts not only to destroy Ukraine, but the contracts to rebuild Ukraine. BlackRock's got all those contracts now that Biden signed with them. And so they're doing it right in front of us, right? And they don't even care that we know about it anymore. But I've spent 40 years litigating against these agencies, and each of the agencies have their own unique cultures and their own unique problems and their own captors. But I have been thinking about for 40 years how to unravel that corporate capture. The most difficult one's the CIA. The person who's running my campaign is Amaryllis Fox, who's, somebody told me it was my daughter-in-law. Somebody said to me the other day, she is the smartest woman I've ever met. And I said, no, she's the smartest person you've ever met. And she's absolutely brilliant, but she spent her life in the CIA, came out, went there idealistically after 9/11, served as a spy in the weapons of mass destruction program, saw the real role of the CIA, and has spent the rest of her life fighting against it and fighting to dismantle the state. My father was very acutely aware of this problem. My uncle had tried to appoint my father as head of the CIA because he said it is a problem. My uncle famously realized during the Bay of Pigs invasion that Allen Dulles and George Bissell and Richard Bissell and George Cabell, who was the military leader of the CIA, had all lied to him. And that they knew that the men were going to die on the beach, and they were hoping that that would make him send the Essex, the aircraft carrier, and he refused. And he came out of that meeting in the middle of the night, and he said to his aide, he publicly took blame for the Bay of Pigs invasion, but privately he said to his aides, I want to take the CIA, shatter it into 1,000 pieces, and scatter it to the winds. And then he tried to appoint my father. My grandfather told him he couldn't do it. He said, it's a very dangerous precedent to have the brother of the President of the United States running this secret police organization. You can't do it. So they brought in a very pious Catholic, John McCone, who was a Republican business guy who they thought would have, because of his real moral center, that he would be able to change the culture of the agency. I was with Mike Pompeo, a very strange dinner that I had about 2 months ago with Mike Pompeo, Hillary Clinton, Karl Rove, Bill Baer, Boris Johnson, the five of us at a table. And really the weirdest dinner I've ever had in my life. But Mike Pompeo said to me, and I never liked Mike Pompeo.
Excuse me, who put this dinner together?
Mike Pompeo said to me, I never liked Mike Pompeo because I thought he's just a warmonger, but
Is that
I
true?
got to like him personally because he's really smart. He's very, very thoughtful. He has a very, very different view of America's role in the world than me, but I thought that he was very sincere and very patriotic. He said to me during that meal, he said, my biggest regret in life is that I did not fix the CIA. And he said, I had an opportunity and I didn't do it. And then he said, the entire upper echelon of that agency are made up of individuals that do not believe in the democratic institutions of the United States of America. Oh, my father saw the same thing. My uncle saw the same thing. My father had a plan for fixing the CIA, which I think I know, which is the same plan that will work today, which is to separate the espionage division from the plans division. Espionage we need. That's information gathering and analysis. The plans division is the dirty tricks division. They are assassinating leaders, fixing elections, coups d'etats, all of this stuff that's gotten us into a mess all over the world. And the fact that those two are married and allows the plans division to spy on us and to control, all of the control the narrative before and after their actions is really what has made them so, so dangerous. And those two functions need to be separated. As it turns out, the last tranche of documents that was released are from the Kennedy assassination papers. Trump promised he'd release them. He didn't. Why? If you ever get him up here, you should say to him, why did you not release them? Because he promised he would. Biden promised he'd release them, and he wouldn't. He didn't. The last tranche that was released included a document that was written by Dick Goodwin and Arthur Schlesinger, two of my uncle's most trusted aides, about how to dismantle the CIA, and it's almost exactly what my father had planned to do. It's what I'll do when I get into office. So yeah.
On the off chance that you're not elected in November,
Yeah.
and that Donald Trump is elected, would you be willing to work for him in some capacity to do what you're talking about?
I don't think so. I mean, I would listen to a proposal, but I don't think so. I don't think.
You wouldn't serve your country?
Well, I'm not confident that I could do that. If I had that confidence, I would. I think. I don't think. Anyway.
What you've been talking about. I mean, the backstory, because we don't have the time, but we're talking about America. And when I interviewed your cousin Caroline Kennedy, at one point we were talking about how your uncle Teddy would exhort you cousins to memorize Longfellow's poem Paul Revere's Ride, and it reminded me of a different America. Because when people talk about, say, I'm a Kennedy Democrat, that's pretty dramatically different than what the party has become. There was a love of country, and I think that when you talk about your uncle's desire, your father's desire to right these wrongs, there's something noble about that, and it's hard not to admire that. And to think that we're 6 decades along and that we're still dealing with this stuff. Most Americans still aren't awake to the narrative. I mean, you're giving us chapter and verse on where the bullets were, and most Americans think, oh, Sirhan, Lee Harvey, and again, not that that's the most important thing, but it points to the deeper truth that we're supposed to be a self-governing people, and it seems that some of the forces that you've been working against have been. They're taking great pains to demonize anybody like you that would question the narrative, and so it seems to me that you have to have hope that people are waking up. I mean, did the 51 people who signed that document denouncing the Hunter Biden laptop as Russian disinformation? I mean, I think that there are many Americans that are aware something very nasty is going on, that we've got to do something about it. And I just think that whether you are in the White House or outside of the White House, that you're uniquely appointed to be working for this. So I'd like to think that America would mean enough to you that.
I would, first of all.
And by the way, if Biden should win, I don't think you're getting a call from him. By the way.
Yeah. No, I'm not. But I do want to just emphasize what you just said about. Those people here may not know what you're talking about. I think most of them do, but there were 51 high-level acting or inactive CIA officials who signed a letter saying that the Hunter Biden laptop was Russian disinformation, which was a lie. It was tampering with the US election, what they were doing. And it was the CIA tampering with the US election. And the fact that, I'm not a fan of Donald Trump's, and one of the reasons that I don't think I'd go to work for him is because he offered me a job in the last administration, and then he took $1 million from Pfizer, and then.
I've heard that story, and I think a lot of us were in a different place at that time. A lot of us have a very different view of Pfizer and Moderna than we did at that point, and actually a very different view of many things than we did at that point.
When somebody looks you in the eye and tells you, I want you to do this, and then, it was a big cost for me to go announce that I'm joining the Trump administration, an enormous cost. And then, and then nothing is there. It makes you less willing to, then entrust to trust that person again. So, like I said, I would listen to a proposal. My objective is to help my country. But.
Well, that, in this day and age, to say that sincerely, it's a beautiful thing. That's why people applaud. And bluntly, I don't see that coming from today's Democratic Party. I'm glad you're an independent, because it's very confusing to Americans who grew up at a time when, Tip O'Neill was the face of the Democratic Party, when we could talk. And I think we're living in difficult times. I'm afraid we are out of time. Can I ask you, in closing, just to say a word about your faith journey? I know that you were at one point an atheist, and in the course of dealing with your heroin addiction, something happened. Can you say before we close?
Yeah, I was never an atheist, ever. But I was raised in a deeply religious family, and I integrated that. We went to church twice a day. We said the rosary at least once a day, at least. We prayed before and after meals. We read the lives of the saints or the Bible every night. Oh, and it wasn't just my 11 siblings and parents. All 29 of the cousins were raised the same way, and we would all see each other at church every morning, etc. So it was a really important part of my life. But when my dad was killed when I was 14. I became a heroin addict when I was 15, and but I was always fighting my addiction. I was taking heroin without my own permission, and I was doing that for a lot of years. And when you're doing that, when you're living against conscience, which is what happens when you're an addict, you tend to push any kind of notion of God over the periphery of your horizon. So, God had become a very, very small thing in my life. And then I had this, I was struggling. By the way, I had very iron willpower always from when I was a kid, and very good discipline. I gave up candy for Lent when I was 13. I never ate candy again until I was in college. And I gave up desserts for Lent when I was 14. I never had another dessert until I was in college. And I was bulking up for sport, for rugby. And I felt I could do anything with my willpower, but this compulsion, the drug compulsion, was just impervious to it. And it was cunning, baffling, and demoralizing. And to me, the most demoralizing feature of addiction was my incapacity to keep contracts with myself. I would tell myself at 9 o'clock in the morning, I'm never going to do that again. And at 4 o'clock, I'd be doing it. And it was baffling to me that I could not bind that person who I was going to be later on in the day to do anything. And I knew when I got sober that I had to change in a deep, fundamental way who I was. And because I didn't want to be an addict, but just be white-knuckling it and be miserable all the time and wanting a drug. And I wanted to be just wake up and not want any drugs. And I knew that was going to require a spiritual awakening. I knew from reading the lives of the saints that there had been people who had been living in all kinds of depravity. St. Augustine was one, St. Francis another, who had these spiritual awakenings and just walked away from addiction. And I had a friend who was a friend of my little brother who died of this disease, David, who was a year difference than me. And he took heroin the same way I did, with the same enthusiasm and compulsion. He became a Mooney. He joined the Unification Church and became a follower of Reverend Sun Myung Moon. And he didn't want to take drugs anymore. And he used to still hang out with us, and we would take drugs right in front of him, but he was zero interest. He was completely indifferent to him. And he would chatter about all of his stuff from the Unification Church. And when I got sober in September of '83, I would think about this guy all the time, and I'd think, I'd rather be dead than be a Mooney. That's what I was thinking at that time. But I wish somehow I could distill whatever it was he had that made him, impervious to this compulsion without becoming a religious nuisance. And at that time, I read a book by Carl Jung called Synchronicity, and the short story is that in that book, he tries to use empirical tools and scientific tools to prove the existence of a God. And he fails. But he says in that book that although he can't scientifically prove the existence of a God, that he could prove that he ran the biggest sanitarium in Europe in Zurich, and he said he could prove, having seen tens of thousands of patients come through his facility, that people who believed in God got better faster than people who didn't, and that their recovery was more durable. And for me, that was a more impactful thing than if he had said that he had proved the existence of a God, which I wouldn't have believed. But what he was saying was that it's irrelevant if there's a God up there. If you believe in one, your chance of staying sober are much better. And I'd already made a commitment to myself that I'd do whatever I needed to do to improve my chances of staying sober by even 1%. So I made a decision, just an intellectual decision. I'm going to start believing in God, and recover what I had lost. And then I was presented with the dilemma that anybody who's in that position would face, which is, how do you start believing in something that you can't see or smell or touch or taste or hear or acquire with your senses? And Jung solves that problem. He says, you fake it till you make it. He said, act as if. And he said, the obedience will precede the evidence. In other words, if you start doing what you're supposed to do, that you will then see an evidence of tangible, undeniable evidence of God's presence in your life. And so I started doing that. I just said, that's what I'm going to do. And I just started pretending that, that there was a God up there watching me all the time, and that everything I did in life was a test. And that, I began breaking my day down into about 40 different decisions. And each of those decisions now, for me, had a moral implication. when the alarm goes off in the morning, do I get immediately out of bed, or do I stay in bed for an extra 20 minutes with my indolent thoughts? Do I make the bed? Most important thing I do during the decision I do every day. Do I hang up the towels, after I use them? When I reach into the closet and pull out a pair of blue jeans and all those little wire hangers fall on the ground, do I shut the door like I used to and say, I'm too much of a big shot, that's somebody else's job? Or do I go in there and clean up my own mess? Do I put the water back in the ice tray before I put the ice tray in the freezer? Do I put the shopping cart where it's supposed to go? And I had this experience when I first got sober. When you're an addict, your life gets very small. But as soon as I got sober, my life started to enlarge dramatically. And I was running about 2 months after, into it. I was running through National Airport in Washington, D.C., and I was late for a plane, and it was mission critical. It was going to be the apocalypse if I didn't catch that plane. And I was certainly going to miss, almost certainly to miss it. And as I ran, I was putting a stick of Dentyne in my mouth, and I wrapped up the little wrapper into a ball, and I threw the wrapper, and it made a perfect arch as I was running into the center of a garbage can, and swish right in. But as I was running by it, I saw out of the corner of my eye, it must have hit something in there because it jumped back out. And I was like, well, that's God's problem because I made the shot. But I got about 40 feet from that trash can. It just started eating at me. And finally, I put on the brakes, and I went back, and I threw it in the garbage can. And for me, that's probably the most important thing I did that day, because the big challenge after you have a spiritual awakening, you can't live off the laurels of a spiritual awakening. You have to, and I had a spiritual awakening that just abolished my desire for drugs and alcohol. But you can't live off the laurels. You have to renew it every day. You have to renew it to display service to others, and you have to renew it by staying in that posture of surrender. I came in a total surrender, my life gone, and was willing at that point to turn my life over to God. But then when the cash and prizes start flowing back in, you're like, thanks God, I got it from here. And then, you take the wheel and drive the car off the cliff again, and then you have to come in on your knees. And the big trick is, how do you stay in that posture of surrender even when your life is filling with abundance, And so...
Are you still pretending that God exists?
Yeah, I don't pretend anymore, because Jung says in his book, Jung never had any doubt of God. Jung saw God everywhere, and with such clarity, and with such texture and grace and joy and just material existence. He didn't even understand what it was like to not have faith. His father had been a preacher, but a dry preacher. His father had been a very important preacher, but he never believed it. He was very good at sort of reciting the conventional shibboleths, but he never had an authentic religious experience. And Jung had those experiences from when he was 3 years old. His biography is just riveting, which is called Memories, Dreams, and Something Remembrances. But he wrote it when he was 86 years old. And his recitation of these experiences that he had from when he was a kid are fascinating. And, he was... Freud was his mentor, and Freud was a total atheist. And they did a tour of America together by train. It's a fascinating book because they ended up splitting on that issue. And Freud really made himself irrelevant, whereas Jung today is, everywhere. Because his approach to healing was all about kind of spiritual connections.
It's very frustrating that we're more than out of time, but I'd like to think that this might be the first of a number of conversations. It's been a privilege. Thank you, Robert F. Kennedy, Jr.
Thank you.
Really great. Thank you.